Have you ever brooded over the paradox of sin within Christianity? The wonky balance between the premise of a benevolent God and the doctrine of sin and redemption, especially in the light of the original sin of Adam and Eve, is challenging to digest. This paradox, along with many others, incites deep and radical contemplations. In Christianity, sin is regarded as a violation against divine law, from righteousness. This concept is deeply woven into the fabric of the human condition, and is often perceived as a prerequisite to every sin, from the primal sin of Adam and Eve to the transgressions of contemporary man, contributes to this complex tapestry. However, it's essential to critically question this paradox. If God is all-wise, wouldn't it be contradictory for him to answer the problem of sin with a greater sin punishment? In Christian theology, the original sin doesn't merely stand for an act of disobedience. It signifies the fall of humankind. When Adam and Eve tasted the prohibited fruit, they ushered sin into a hitherto flawless world. Yet, the paradox stands. Why would a wise God address sin with a greater sin, creating a cyclical pattern of transgression and punishment? Indeed, herein lies an intriguing paradox. The same divine entity who expresses disdain for sin paradoxically chose to confront the problem of original sin through a deed that might be perceived by some as an even graver sin: his own sacrifice in the guise of his Son, Jesus Christ. A deity of absolute purity and righteousness was sentenced to death by crucifixion with the aim to salvage a sinful mankind. This act prompts a multitude of questions. How can we reconcile the concept of God who despises sin, yet masterminds his own demise as a means of atonement? Does this act reflect profound love, or does it present itself as a paradox? It truly challenges our understanding of the divine plan and the logic that underlies such a paradoxical act. Christian theology attempts to shed light on this paradox, proposing that God, in his boundless love and mercy, chose to shoulder the burden of sin himself. By assuming the weight of humanity's wrongdoings, he opened up a road to redemption. However, far from being a sin, this act is perceived as the zenith of divine love and grace. Yet the paradox persists. In conclusion, the so-called paradox of sin within Christianity proves to be an enigma that demands intense scrutiny. It necessitates wrestling with the idea of sin as an offense against a seemingly arbitrary divine law, the concept of the original sin, and the proposition of salvation via divine sacrifice. Ultimately, it all loops back to the foundational claims of Christianity: the love, grace, and mercy of a God supposedly eager to shoulder the burden of sin for his creation. However, these notions raise critical questions about the logic and complexity enveloped within Christian theology. It also highlights the paradoxical nature of divine love, offering a critique of the depth, complexity, and enduring strength of religious doctrines. Voiceover. In the sweeping saga of Christian theology, the Lord, in his disdain for sin, purportedly responds to the disaster with an even larger disaster. The first disaster, the original sin, was conceived from human defiance to God. This defiance, a blatant violation of divine law, signified the downfall of humankind. The second disaster, though, was on an unthinkable scale. It was the elimination of God himself. In the divine sacrifice, there exists a paradox that raises numerous questions. Humanity, the very creation of God, stood guilty of both disasters. The first, disobedience, marked the commencement of sin. The second, deicide, was an act so inconceivable that it defied human understanding. Yet it was this very act that was touted as the foundation of redemption and salvation in Christian theology. God himself reputedly recognized the second disaster as a greater, Matthew 26:24. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. The book Tufat al-Jil, in the interpretation of the Gospel, comments on this verse, saying on page 26, "It is as if it is saying, woe to the one who betrays me. And there is no greater woe than his, for he will be in the depths of hell because he is the murderer of Christ and God, and his sin is very grave." But the matter is even worse than that. Why? Because spitting on the face of Christ, their sin is more despicable and horrifying than the sin of Adam, as mentioned in the book The Gospel Sermons. In Adam's sin, we see disobedience to God as he ate from the forbidden tree. But we see that the sin of those who spit on the face of Christ is more despicable and horrifying than his sin. For Adam did not dare to spit on his God. On the contrary, we see that as soon as he heard, His voice in paradise, he felt ashamed and hid among the trees. Surely, if he had seen one of his children or descendants daring to commit this heinous act of spitting in the face of his God, he would have immediately risen and punished them. The Gospel Sermons Book, Christian Nile Printing Press, 1925, Piedmont. Can a rational person bear all this nonsense? A symbol of his infinite love and mercy. In face of the supreme violation, he opted to proffer forgiveness and salvation. This fundamentally is the paradox of sin in Christianity, a layered and profound concept that provokes intense scrutiny. But does this not beg the question? Is it logical or moral to counter a calamity with an even greater one? Could the omnipotent and benevolent God not have found a different solution? One did not involve such immense suffering? This is the critical examination of the paradox within Christianity, encouraging us to question and explore deeper,